I now call Michelle from Temasek Junior College to continue the case for the proposition and the Ministry of Finance.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm Michelle, and I'm going to further the case for the Ministry of Finance. Before I begin my substantive case, I'm going to answer some points of contention brought up by our opposition today, with their alternative policy of targeted assistance. Now, firstly, we would like to clarify that we have already told them that our policy is not mutually exclusive with other policies out there. Should the poor get subsidies, coupons, and the other things of that ilk, we don't necessarily disagree with that. Today, we are proposing a policy that, as my first speaker has explained to you, there is a need for because of the lower middle class. No, thank you, sir. You have brought up the point of how the poor need more refunds and more subsidies and more coupons, but we tell you that they are already getting that. And we are today targeting instead the lower middle class that was not included in your policy. Secondly, they tell us that we are going to subsidize... No, thank you, ma'am. They have told us that we're going to subsidize for the poor in light of the recent financial crisis. But this has already been going on. With our policy, where we lower the GST on all essential goods, what happens is that the people see that the government is doing something new, something tangible, something to help them. And that is what we want to achieve. We do not want to be doing the same old thing. And we see that with a new crisis, people are going to need more aid. And that is why we need to subsidize on essential goods for these people. They tell us that the lowering of GST is going to be insignificant because you're only saving $1 on a bag of rice. But we tell you this, who buys a bag of rice only in a month? People buy a lot of things, and 7% can be a lot, especially if your income is low. The low-income earners spend up to 60% of their income on essential goods. Do you think that 7% of that is significant to them? I would think so. And lowering this by what my speaker has suggested of 3.5% is going to be savings in half, which is going to help them tide over this difficult period. And that is why, as the government, we should be using our surplus to do this. And despite the accusations that this is a poor use of our surplus, we beg to differ. Instead, we say that by using our surplus to help our people, we are showing that we care and we understand the problems that they are going through in light of the financial crisis. And now, with that being said, I will be continuing to further the case for the proposition today. Now, my first speaker has already shown you how our policy is addressing the need of the sandwich class, the lower middle class that does not have subsidies, that is going to suffer from this financial crisis, and that does need our help. I am going to talk now about how our policy is more cost efficient than any of the other policies out there, which is why there is a need for us to implement it. Our policy's cost efficiency is rooted in the idea that there are no administrative costs for lowering GST once the lowering has been carried out by sending out a list of items detailing which items should have their GST lowered. With other methods that are existing to target the same problems that we want to target, such as tax rebates, there is great administrative cost. Let's look at GST tax rebates. When we carry out GST tax rebates, we need to do things such as means testing, and I'm going to explain how the lack of means testing required in our policy is beneficial because of the lower cost. Because there is no means testing, and because the effect is immediate once we issue out the order to lower GST, the people do not need to go through levels of bureaucracy, nor do they need to carry out means testing where we gauge their means in order to allocate a sufficient amount of funding to them. When we lower the GST on all essential goods, what happens is that this benefits everyone. GST is a regressive tax, as they have pointed out, and because it is a regressive tax, the rich and the poor are not penalized in the same way. In fact, the poor are penalized more than the rich, because 7% of the price of a loaf of bread is going to be more to a poor man than it is to a rich man, in that the rich spend a lower proportion of their income on GST. But for the poor, they're going to benefit more conversely when we reverse this. So we see that lowering GST is going to allocate funds to you in proportion to your need naturally, and there is no need for means testing. With GST tax rebates, we carry out means testing, and we have to do this through gauging through indicators such as the number of rooms in one's HDB flat and things like that. But we see that, firstly, this is a waste of resources because we have to carry it out. Secondly, when we carry out means testing, it might not even be an accurate gauge of one's means because when we look at indicators such as this, it does not necessarily fully reflect one's ability to foot the cost or the amount of aid that they need. And that is why the GST tax rebate allows the people to do what they need because they are buying these essential goods according to their own needs. And thus we see how this sufficiently and efficiently provides for them. And so there's also lower administrative costs because when we carry out other alternatives such as tax rebates or offset packages where lump sum is issued to the people, we see that there's administrative costs, such as keeping tabs on them, documentation, and other extraneous paperwork. But with this measure, it is all-encompassing. It covers everybody. It does it fast, efficiently, and immediately. And that is why our policy is preferable in terms of its efficiency and its efficacy. And with that, please go with our side of the House. Thank you.
I now call Charmaine from River Valley High School to advance the case for the opposition and her team.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, the opposition recognises that the recession is a great strain on the population, and indeed that the government is obliged to address the concerns of all income groups. However, as the proposition has already mentioned, they want to decrease GST on essential goods by 3.5% mainly to tide over the recession and to help the poor and the sandwich class, which is the middle class. However, this is targeted only towards the consumption of essential goods. And no thanks. Actually, there is simply no point in decreasing GST because the poor will still be able to afford basic necessities with GST offsets from the government, which they are already receiving. For example, the absorption of GST for house brand products that make them very affordably priced. No thanks, sir. In fact, this is not only for the poor, but it also applies to the sandwich class, which is the middle class, as the prices of all house brand products under NTUC Fair Price are priced fairly and are not and will not be no thanks, ma'am. And will not be affected by and has not been affected by the recent 2% GST hike. Moving on, as the second speaker of the proposition mentioned that the poor has already been receiving enough GST offsets. Well, it's obviously not enough, or else why? No thanks, sir. Or else why do you still see the poor and desolate struggling and continuing to appeal to the government to obtain offsets and different kinds of financial aid? Besides, how many?
Point, madam.
No thanks, madam. Besides, how many families in Singapore are struggling to afford essential goods? It is known that only a small percentage of Singaporeans that live in one-room flats and are jobless, disabled, or old require this kind of financial aid. This only goes to show how the proposition's policy is only going to effectively help such a small group of citizens. If the government is concerned about helping the poor and the middle class, why not just give them direct aid? Well, under the policy of targeted assistance that is already in place and is advocated by the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, taking into consideration your age, your salary and size of home, you are entitled to payouts, specifically GST credits, which is injected into your bank account. How would that feel compared to the intangible 3% discount that, no thanks, ma'am, that the propositions offers you only and only when you buy essential goods? The workfare income supplement that is already in place, that is targeted at working adults above the age of 35 and drawing a salary below $1,500 monthly, gives payouts that matches their income. The opposition's policy that advocates this policy of targeted assistance in this case reaches out and is already tailored to different needs and different income groups.
Madam?
Unlike the flat 3% GST drop, which shows that people can cope well with the 7% GST and that there is no need to decrease it. Now, having looked at the problems in the proposition's policy, I'll now tell you about the opposition's solution. Instead of releasing a few $1 billion worth of GST revenue into other hands without being able to ensure the desired result. The GST revenue, the government should have an alternative use for this money, as my first speaker has already mentioned, which is to fund capital investment for infrastructure that will stimulate the economy. Infrastructure, which ensures which includes the sector of research and development, are exactly what Singapore's progress hinges on, and funding for such capital investments is essential to ensure that Singapore is able to sustain high and non-inflationary growth even during these times of crisis. The GST revenue already serves an indispensable purpose of funding payouts to the needy under the workfare income supplement, and in fact, the previous GST hike enabled the government to decrease corporate income tax by 2 percentage points, which will continue to help both citizens and businesses tide through the recession, provided no part of the GST is compromised by the decrease in GST. Not only will keeping the GST at 7% allow the government to stimulate the economy by spending GST revenue on an infrastructure that will benefit one and all, it will also redistribute wealth so as to bring closer the extreme ends. This will help to close up the rich-poor divide, unlike lowering GST, which will widen the gap and add to economic instability. Moreover, decreasing GST might result in worsening the recession by shaping mindsets around the severity of the economic crisis to an extent that the government has to lower GST on essential goods like rice. Won't this action lead one to think that the government is worried that we might not be able to afford essentials in this economic crisis without financial aid. The idea of facing such a serious recession will cause many to be less willing to spend, not allowing cash to circulate in the economy and stagnating it at the point of recession. In conclusion, what has the opposition shown you today? We have shown you exactly the proposition's policy will be more than likely to provide low benefits, be insignificant in stimulating the economy, and possibly worsening the recession for Singapore. We have also shown you how the policy of targeted assistance that is already in place now requires the same budget from the surpluses of the GST revenue. We are able to achieve circulation in the economy by helping different income groups while improving the infrastructure at the same time. Therefore, this motion must fall. Thank you.